The Hunter in the Pines. Abigail Miller, fresh out of high school and on the cusp of a new chapter in her life, decided to embark on a solo hiking trip in the Coconino National Forest. Nestled near Flagstaff, Arizona, the forest's dense pines and rugged mountains promised a perfect escape before she headed off to college. Abby was eager to embrace the solitude, hoping the tranquility of nature would clear her mind and provide a sense of peace. As she ventured deeper into the forest, the beauty of the surroundings was overshadowed by a growing unease. She began to notice subtle signs that something was amiss, footsteps that seemed to echo her own, the faint rustle of leaves as if someone was trailing her, and odd disturbances in the brush that made her heart race. Though she tried to dismiss these as mere jitters, the feeling of being watched gnawed at her, casting a shadow over what was meant to be a peaceful retreat. Just as Abby decided it was time to turn back, the sense of unease too strong to ignore, she was suddenly ambushed. Out of nowhere, a figure emerged from the dense foliage. A man, his movements swift and precise. Before she could scream or run, he overpowered her with terrifying efficiency. The man, a serial killer who had been silently stalking her every step, had chosen this moment to strike. He was methodical, practiced, and knew the forest better than anyone. For years, he had been using this remote wilderness as his personal hunting ground, preying on unsuspecting hikers who ventured too far from safety. When Abby regained consciousness, she found herself in a dimly lit, claustrophobic space, a makeshift underground bunker buried deep within the forest. Her wrists and ankles were bound, the rough ropes biting into her skin. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw the grim reality of her situation. Scattered around the bunker were personal belongings, faded photographs, and other chilling mementos of the killer's previous victims. Each item told a story of someone who had walked these same trails, never to be seen again. Fear surged through her, but Abby knew she had to stay calm. The full horror of her predicament settled in, and she realized that if she was going to survive, she would need to summon every ounce of her wits and willpower to outsmart her captor and escape this nightmare. Despite the overwhelming fear that gripped her, Abby refused to give in to despair. She knew that her only chance of survival was to outsmart the killer who had trapped her. Carefully, she began to observe his routines, how he moved, where he kept his tools, and the small, seemingly insignificant details he overlooked. Abby noticed that he grew careless after he assumed she was too weak and frightened to pose a threat. Using the few resources at her disposal, Abby managed to loosen her restraints. She found a small, jagged piece of metal hidden among the debris in the bunker, which she used to gradually wear down the ropes that bound her. She bided her time, waiting for the perfect moment to act. That moment came when the killer, confident in his control, left a key within her reach. With her heart pounding, Abby grabbed the key, unlocked her restraints, and silently prepared for her escape. When the killer returned, he didn't notice anything amiss until it was too late. Abby struck, catching him off guard and making her desperate escape into the night. The dense forest, once a place of peace, became a labyrinth of fear as she sprinted through the underbrush, the cold air burning her lungs. Behind her, the killer, enraged by her defiance, gave chase. His heavy footsteps crashed through the forest, a terrifying reminder that he was always close behind. Abby's knowledge of the terrain and her survival instincts kicked in as she navigated the dark, twisted paths. She used every trick she could think of, doubling back, hiding in the shadows, and using the natural cover of the forest to her advantage. But no matter how fast she ran or how cleverly she evaded him, the killer was relentless, his presence a constant, suffocating threat in the shadows. The game of cat and mouse continued, the stakes higher than ever. as Abby fought for her life against a predator who was determined not to let his prey escape. Exhausted, bloodied, and barely able to stand, Abby finally stumbled upon a remote ranger station, its warm light a beacon of hope in the dark, unforgiving forest. She burst through the door, her voice trembling as she recounted the harrowing ordeal she had just survived. The ranger on duty, a tall, stoic man, listened intently, offering her a blanket and comforting words. He assured her that she was safe now, that the nightmare was over. But as Abby's initial relief began to fade, a gnawing sense of unease crept in. Something about the ranger felt off. His boots, mud-caked and worn, were identical to those her captor had worn. And then there were his eyes, cold and calculating, with a chilling familiarity that sent a shiver down her spine. Her heart pounded as the realization began to dawn on her. But before she could react, the lights in the station flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A soft, ominous click echoed through the room as the door locked behind her, sealing her fate. Panic surged through Abby as she scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. The ranger's voice, calm and eerily familiar, cut through the darkness, sending a wave of terror through her. "You should have run faster," he whispered, his tone dripping with the same sinister edge as the killer who had hunted her. In that moment, Abby realized with sickening clarity that her nightmare was far from over. She was still trapped, now in the clutches of a predator even more cunning and dangerous than she had imagined. The story ends with Abby's desperate realization that her fight for survival has only just begun, as the darkness closes in around her. Taken under the stars. Rachel Evans, a 25-year-old freelance photographer, had always been captivated by the beauty of the natural world. With a camera always in hand, she sought out the most stunning and remote locations to capture moments that most people would never see. When she heard about Mount Shasta, California, famous not only for its breathtaking landscapes but also for its long history of strange disappearances and UFO sightings, Rachel knew she had to see it for herself. The mountain's mystical reputation only added to her excitement, as she imagined the extraordinary photographs she might take there. After a long drive, Rachel finally arrived at Mount Shasta. The towering pine trees and the majestic silhouette of the mountain against the sky filled her with a sense of awe. She spent the first few days scouting locations, but it was the night sky she was most eager to capture. On her third evening, she set up her camera in a secluded part of the forest, away from the usual trails, hoping to photograph the stars in all their brilliance. As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped the forest, Rachel's focus sharpened. She adjusted her camera settings, preparing for the perfect shot. That's when she noticed something unusual: strange lights moving erratically across the sky. At first, she thought they might be planes or satellites, but their movements were too unpredictable, too erratic. Fascinated, Rachel's curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed her camera and ventured deeper into the woods, following the lights as they flickered and danced above the trees. With each step, the lights seemed to pull her in, their glow becoming more intense. Rachel felt an odd, almost hypnotic pull, as if they were drawing her closer. The forest around her grew darker and more mysterious, but she hardly noticed, her attention completely consumed by the mesmerizing lights in the sky. As she ventured further, the world around her seemed to fade away, leaving only the lights and the strange, inexplicable urge to keep going. As Rachel ventured deeper into the forest, the strange lights overhead seemed to pulse with an eerie, rhythmic hum that resonated through the trees. The sound, at first barely noticeable, grew louder and more insistent, lulling her into a trance-like state. Her thoughts became hazy, and she lost all sense of time and direction. The familiar world around her seemed to dissolve into the darkness, leaving only the lights and the hypnotic hum that filled her mind. Rachel's steps became slower, more deliberate, as if she were sleepwalking. She had no idea how far she had wandered from her original spot or how long she had been following the lights. All she knew was that she had to keep moving forward, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. The lights, now closer than ever, descended from the sky, bathing the forest in a blinding, otherworldly glow. Rachel felt her body grow weightless, her surroundings fading away entirely as the light consumed her. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. The rhythmic hum that had echoed through the forest was gone, leaving behind an eerie silence. Where Rachel had once stood, there was now nothing but darkness. Her camera and all her belongings were left scattered on the forest floor, abandoned and forgotten. The only trace of her was the faint echo of the hum lingering in the still air, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Rachel's disappearance was swift and complete. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just an empty, silent forest, and the sense that something unimaginable had happened. For anyone who might come looking for her, there would be no clues, no answers. Rachel was simply gone, taken into the unknown, leaving behind only questions that would never be answered. Days later, Rachel awoke with a start, lying in the middle of a vast, unfamiliar field. The tall grass swayed gently in the breeze, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the landscape. She was miles away from where she had last been, with no recollection of how she got there. Disoriented and weak, her body felt heavy, as if she had been asleep for days. Her mind was a foggy blur, fragmented memories slipping through her grasp whenever she tried to recall what had happened. The last thing she remembered was the blinding light in the forest, and then nothing. Panic gripped her as she tried to make sense of her situation. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her hands scraped and bruised. Rachel forced herself to stand, her legs shaky beneath her, and began to make her way back to civilization. The journey was long and disorienting, but eventually, she found her way to the nearest town and called for help. She was desperate to understand what had occurred, but no one had answers for her. The doctors who examined her found nothing physically wrong, but Rachel knew that something was different. Something had changed. When Rachel returned home, she tried to resume her normal life, but the world no longer felt the same. As the days passed, she began to notice strange, unexplainable changes in herself. It started with her vision. She realized that her eyes now had a faint, almost imperceptible glow in the dark. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she looked closer, the glow became undeniable. Then came the voices, soft, alien whispers that echoed in her mind, speaking in a language she had never heard before. The whispers were distant at first, easy to ignore, but they grew louder and more insistent with each passing day. Rachel's once clear thoughts became muddled, invaded by the strange language that she couldn't understand but somehow felt drawn to. The changes were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as the effects of stress or exhaustion, but they soon became impossible to ignore. Her reflection in the mirror seemed foreign to her, the glow in her eyes a constant reminder that something was profoundly wrong. The whispers grew stronger, invading her dreams, filling her waking hours with an uneasy sense of dread. Rachel knew that whatever had happened to her in those lost days had left a mark, one that was growing stronger, altering her in ways she couldn't comprehend. As the changes continued to unfold, Rachel was left with a chilling realization. She was no longer entirely herself, and the alien presence within her was becoming impossible to deny. As the days passed, Rachel's fear grew into an overwhelming terror. The changes in her body and mind intensified, and she became increasingly disturbed by the alien whispers that echoed in her head. She avoided mirrors, terrified of what she might see in her reflection. But the fear gnawed at her, until one day, she could no longer resist the urge to confront whatever was happening to her. Summoning all her courage, Rachel stood before the mirror, bracing herself for the worst. At first, all she saw was her own pale, drawn face, the faint glow in her eyes now a constant reminder of her transformation. But as she stared deeper, something shifted. Within the dark depths of her pupils, she saw it, a faint but unmistakable reflection of one of the alien beings that had taken her. The creature's cold, expressionless face stared back at her from within her own eyes, its presence undeniable and terrifying. The realization hit Rachel like a tidal wave. She was not alone in her body. The alien presence was inside her, watching the world through her eyes, possibly influencing her thoughts and actions. The whispers in her mind were not just voices. They were the thoughts of the entity that now shared her existence. Panic surged through her as she understood the full horror of her situation. She had been forever altered, no longer entirely human, and the alien within her was permanent. As Rachel backed away from the mirror, the truth settled in with chilling finality. She was trapped, her body no longer entirely her own, and the alien's presence was growing stronger. The story ends with Rachel's final, horrifying understanding that her fate, and possibly that of others, was now uncertain, as the alien presence within her continued to unfold its unknown intentions. Echoes of the Mind. Jessica Jess Lawrence, a 19-year-old college freshman, had always been a sensitive soul, prone to bouts of anxiety and melancholy. The move to Asheville, North Carolina, for college was supposed to be a fresh start, but instead, it only deepened her struggles. Far from home and overwhelmed by the pressures of academic life, Jess found herself sinking into a severe depression. The vibrant college atmosphere that surrounded her felt alien and suffocating. As the weeks passed, she withdrew further into herself, finding little solace in the crowded dorms and bustling campus. The only place where Jess felt even a shred of peace was in nature. The Blue Ridge Mountains, with their sprawling forests and serene vistas, became her refuge. She would often escape there, hiking alone for hours, the solitude of the mountains offering her a temporary escape from her inner turmoil. The beauty of the landscape, the quiet rustling of leaves, and the distant calls of wildlife provided a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. The mountains became her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe, away from the pressures that weighed so heavily on her. But one day, Jess didn't return from her hike. Her friends, already worried about her, reported her missing, and a search party was quickly organized. The search efforts were extensive, with volunteers combing through the trails and the dense forests of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Yet, despite their best efforts, no trace of Jess was found. There were no footprints, no belongings left behind, and no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The mysterious circumstances surrounding her disappearance left everyone baffled and concerned, especially Detective Sarah Mills, who was assigned to the case. Mills, driven by her own personal demons, became deeply invested in uncovering what had happened to Jess, her obsession growing as the case refused to yield any answers. Detective Sarah Mills, a seasoned but troubled 37-year-old, was assigned to the case of Jessica Lawrence's disappearance. From the moment she read the initial reports, Mills felt a deep, almost personal connection to the case. Perhaps it was because of her own unresolved struggles, grief, loss, and the weight of cases that had gone cold in the past, that she found herself unable to let go. Jess's disappearance became more than just another case. It became an obsession. As Mills delved deeper into Jess's life, she uncovered the troubling extent of the young woman's mental health struggles. Interviews with friends and professors painted a picture of a girl teetering on the edge, her anxiety and depression worsening since her move to Asheville. But it was Jess's journal, discovered in her dorm room, that truly alarmed Mills. The entries started off as typical reflections of a struggling student, but they soon spiraled into something darker. Jess wrote of a persistent feeling of being watched, of shadows that followed her during her hikes, and of a particular spot in the Blue Ridge Mountains that filled her with both dread and fascination. This spot, Mills learned, was more than just a random location in the mountains. It was steeped in local legend. The townspeople whispered about a curse, a place where people were said to disappear without a trace, swallowed by the mountains themselves. The stories were old, passed down through generations, and while most dismissed them as mere folklore, there were those who believed in the power of the cursed land. Mills, a rational detective, struggled to reconcile these tales with her training. But the deeper she dug, the more the lines between reality and legend blurred. The case began to consume her. Mills found herself drawn to the same spot that Jess had been obsessed with, a place where the air seemed thicker, the shadows darker. The more she investigated, the more she questioned whether Jess's disappearance was the result of her fragile mental state or if something far more sinister was at play. As Mills spent more time in the mountains, she felt the pull that Jess had described, a sense of being watched, of something just beyond her sight, waiting. The once clear boundaries of her investigation became clouded, as Mills felt herself slipping into the same paranoia that had gripped Jess in her final days. Determined to uncover the truth behind Jessica Lawrence's disappearance, Detective Sarah Mills decided to retrace Jess's last known steps into the Blue Ridge Mountains. Armed with Jess's journal, which had become a disturbing roadmap to the young woman's final days, Mills ventured deep into the woods. The journal's pages detailed Jess's growing fear, the strange occurrences that plagued her hikes, and the ominous spot that seemed to hold a dark power over her. As Mills walked the same paths, she couldn't shake the eerie sense that she was walking in Jess's shadow, following her into the unknown. As Mills ventured further into the mountains, she began to experience the same unsettling sensations that Jess had described. The wind whispered through the trees, but the whispers seemed to form words, incomprehensible yet somehow filled with intent. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, darting between trees, always just out of sight. The deeper she went, the stronger the feeling became that she was not alone, that something was watching her, studying her every move. It was as if the mountains themselves were alive, their ancient presence pressing down on her, making it harder to breathe, harder to think clearly. The more time Mills spent in the mountains, the more her grip on reality began to slip. The journal, once a source of clarity, now felt like a harbinger of doom. Each entry mirrored her own experience, as if Jess's words were predicting her fate. The shadows seemed to grow bolder, moving closer, and the whispers in the wind became more insistent, more demanding. Mills's thoughts grew fragmented, her once sharp mind clouded by fear and doubt. She found herself questioning everything, her surroundings, her senses, even her own sanity. As the days wore on, Mills's paranoia escalated. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent her heart racing. She felt eyes on her, an oppressive presence that she couldn't escape. The rational part of her mind tried to dismiss these fears as the result of exhaustion and stress, but another part, the part that had read Jess's journal too many times, began to wonder if there really was something in these mountains. Something malevolent that had claimed Jess and was now coming for her. The once clear lines between reality and legend had blurred, leaving Mills lost in a haze of fear and confusion. Each step she took brought her closer to the truth, but also closer to the same fate that had befallen Jess. The mountains were no longer just a place. They had become a living nightmare, one that threatened to consume Mills just as they had consumed Jess. In a final, desperate attempt to find Jessica Lawrence, Detective Sarah Mills forced herself to return to the cursed spot in the mountains. Her mind was fraying, unraveling under the weight of the strange occurrences and the oppressive dread that had plagued her since she began her investigation. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the voices that had once whispered on the wind now roared in her ears, taunting her with unintelligible words. Visions of shadowy figures danced at the edge of her vision, always just out of reach, yet unmistakably there. Each step toward the spot felt like stepping closer to the edge of an abyss. When Mills finally reached the cursed spot, she was overwhelmed by a crushing sense of dread. The same dread Jess had described in her journal. It was as if the air itself was alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The realization dawned on her with horrifying clarity. Whatever had taken Jess was now after her. The mountain wasn't just a landscape, it was a predator, and she was its next victim. And then, just as Jess had before her, Detective Mills vanished. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone, leaving behind only her notebook. The search for Mills mirrored the earlier search for Jess, but just like before, no trace was found. No footprints, no belongings, no signs of struggle. It was as if the mountains had swallowed her whole. The story ends with the discovery of Mills's notebook, the final entry eerily echoing Jess's last words, filled with confusion and terror. The notebook stands as the only testament to Mills's descent into madness and her final, mysterious disappearance, suggesting that the same dark fate that claimed Jess had now claimed her too, leaving no one left to uncover the truth of what really lurks in the mountains.